Welcome to GLOBEWATCH with me, Charles EBUNE. Africa is capable of achieving its own development really well. That is what the African Capacity Building Foundation affirms. It was established in 1991 by African governments and its development partners to ensure a sustainable development of the African continent through the production of high-quality material that critically exposed the troubles affecting the continent at a time when the continent was on one of their crossroads. The African Capacity Building Foundation is striking a deal to solve the problems today in Africa, which are not quite different from what obtained when it was established in 1991. Can we successfully say by 2017 they have lived up to their mission statement? My guest today on GLOBEWATCH is the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation. Professor Emmanuel Nnadozie, welcome to GLOBEWATCH.
Thank you.
There is a cliche that Africa is rising. Has the African Capacity Building Foundation contributed to that?
Yes, indeed, the African Capacity Building Foundation has contributed significantly to assisting African countries to achieve their development objectives and to be where they are today in terms of the economic growth that is very respectable, in terms of improving the lives of men and women of Africa, and in terms of helping to promote democracy and political stability across the continent.
You just said that the African Capacity Building Foundation has contributed to where the African economies are today. Where are we at the level of the African economies today? What is their nature today?
No, as you can see, if you compare African countries today to where they were in the early 60s when many of the countries got their independence, you would realize that in every sphere of human endeavor, whether it's in the political arena or it's in the economic arena or it's even in the building of institutions and promoting regional integration, you would see that African countries have made significant steps because at independence, you would hardly see a number of roads that are tarred, access to potable water, even electricity, not to mention institutions of higher learning and all the other kinds of institutions and human capacity that is necessary to really promote development. But today, the story is completely different. You go to every city, you see that there's a massive urbanization taking place. There's a huge middle class that is emerging. There's also the diversification of economies of many African countries that are becoming more and more industrialized, and that many opportunities exist everywhere. But does that mean that Africa is exactly where it should be? Does it mean that the continent has fulfilled its potential? The answer is no. There's still room for improvement. And we at the ACBF have been playing our own part in assisting African countries to really achieve their full potential, whether it's in terms of building the capacity of men and women, or building the capacity of institutions, or even helping to promote development in general. We have been playing a key role at the continental level, at the regional level, and at the country level.
Back in 1991, when the African Capacity Building Foundation was established, most African economies, and by extension countries, were at crossroads. The democratization process, heavy debts with the IMF, the World Bank, economies were in recession. In 2017, and as I speak to you, it is almost the same atmosphere. So many African economies are almost in recession. There is a kind of going back to the IMF for assistance at the World Bank, it seems as if we are still on the same spot. Why the deadlock?
Well, first of all, we have to distinguish between the sort of cyclical economic problems or recessions that you can have with some of the long-term trends. If you look at the long-term trends, you would see that the trajectory has been mostly positive. In fact, African countries were so resilient, they were able to withstand the global economic crisis far much better than any other countries, because they were not heavily indebted, because they were managing the economies far much better than they did in the 70s. Thanks to the sort of capacity building programs that ACBF and others have done in strengthening economic management capacity in the continent. But having said that, we should also realize that we cannot generalize too much about the African continent. There are countries, especially those that are heavily dependent on primary commodity exports or minerals, that have been severely affected by the global economic downturn.
Nigeria, Gabon,
well, even Cameroon is also a part of that,
yeah.
Exactly. And they are the ones who are having to bear the heavy burden of the slowdown in first of all, the drop in the prices of these commodities, as well as the slowdown in demand for those commodities. But this goes to the heart of the problem of the African economies, the lack of diversification and lack of economic transformation and industrialization. And this is what we have been promoting at ACBF, that every country needs to really pay attention to an industrialization strategy, building the critical skills that are necessary, strengthening the key institutions, and undertaking this industrialization so that they can create jobs for the African young people.
You just spoke about job creation. One of your mission statements is to improve governance on the continent and ensure that there is transformation, which you were talking about. But one key issue which remains a headache is the level of corruption on the continent. And the Kofi Annan report indicates that roughly $50 billion leave the continent each year through illicit financial flows, which are not far from corruption practices. How much have you been investing to reduce the rate and level of corruption on the continent so that the resources have a direct net impact on the people?
Well, I think we need to realize that corruption is everywhere in the world, and Africa is not necessarily a more corrupt continent than elsewhere in the world.
That should be a wrong consoling statement, right?
Well, because we tend to often try to mistakenly think that Africa is probably more corrupt than anywhere else, and I disagree with that completely, because corruption exists everywhere. I don't want to name names, but there's a whole lot of things going on. But having said that, one shouldn't be comforted by the fact that you are not as corrupt as others, because I can tell you there are certain countries where I will point out in the continent, and you can hardly see any corruption going on. But
Rwanda, for example.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. But the point I'm making is corruption everywhere is something that has a destabilizing effect on economies. It worsens poverty. It creates. It actually can lead to state failure eventually if care is not taken, because we have seen experiences of that. But the issue here is mostly when you mention the illicit financial flows. The largest proportion of funds flowing illicitly out of the continent is not from corruption, although corruption is part of it. It is from practices of multinational companies in terms of tax evasion, transfer mispricing, and other kinds of things that they do to avoid maybe paying their contribution to the continent. So that's very important to note. And African countries, just as you saw the story about Great Britain when what's the name of this coffee company, the coffee maker from the United States, was unable to pay taxes for several years, and the British government could not even be able to get that because of the sophistication that's involved in the practices. So African countries do not necessarily have the capacity to really confront these illicit outflows. But there's hope, because the Mbeki panel that was created some years ago, I had the privilege of working with that. We were able to really identify the sources of the problem, the magnitude of the problem, and we're able to really help African countries to begin to build the necessary capacity that they need to be able to confront this flow.
Building partnership is one of your benchmarks. How do you network with development partners to carry out projects that impact ordinary African lives? I understand that a few years back you negotiated a roughly $3 million deal to help Djibouti.
Yes, partnership is a critical approach to our own capacity building initiatives in the continent, because the challenge is quite significant, and no one institution or organization can really address this problem alone. So strategic partnerships with the African Union, for example, with the African Development Bank, with the UN Economic Commission for Africa, with NEPAD, and with the countries themselves and other external partners, in terms of maybe leveraging our own areas of comparative advantage and making sure that we bring our complementarities to work together. So we have built this sort of partnerships. Some of them are just at the technical level, and some are in terms of bringing our resources to bear upon that. For instance, we are here in Cameroon, starting from tomorrow, we're going to work with the Pan-African Parliament to be able to see how we can effectively improve governance on the continent and the role that the parliaments can play in really ensuring that natural resources are used to the benefit of the people. We're working with IDEA, the international IDEA. We're also working with other organizations to bring this together. So that's an example of where partnerships can play a role. But speaking about good governance also, ACBF has really supported many, many parliaments across the continent, strengthened their ability to play their oversight role and to be able to really put forward some very effective legislations and help to promote the welfare of their people.
So many institutions on the continent do the job you are doing. The UN Economic Commission for Africa does almost the same job. The African Capacity Building Initiative does almost the same job. The IMF comes in and does almost the same job. The World Bank. Where are you uniquely different from all other institutions?
Well, what you have described about many people being involved, or what I may call the crowded terrain, shows you the enormity of the problem. Because as we speak right now, the amount of demand that we receive on a daily basis from member states, from organizations, from non-governmental organizations, civil society, businesses, and all that, for support is quite significant and quite staggering. It shows you that there is opportunity and there is significant challenges that remain on the continent. And having said that, we need to recognize that in 1991, there was a need to really create an organization that's uniquely focusing on capacity development. And that was in essence of the African Capacity Building Foundation. And ACBF is not only the premier organization to build capacity on the continent, it is one that is uniquely focusing on that has so many strengths, because it's a member state, it's a Pan-African organization, member state organization, where we have the governors and the ministers of finance and planning of various African countries being the governors of ACBF. And also we have an organizational, institutional framework that really helps us to really deliver capacity development in a very unique way. And secondly, two, we have partnerships with the donors as well as the continental and international organizations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, of course the African Development Bank and the UNDP, with whom we work together. So often what happens is that instead of competition, we bring our complementarity. And ACBF has the mandate to coordinate and lead capacity development on the continent. We are now a specialized agency of the African Union, as you may know, charged with building capacity for implementation of Agenda 2063. So I don't really see any competition or any problem. The problems are so huge that everybody is welcome to play their own role as well.
You have repeatedly used the expression capacity building in the course of the interview. What does capacity building mean at the level of the African Capacity Building Foundation?
For us, capacity building simply means making sure that individuals, organizations, and countries have the ability to use their own resources and their abilities to achieve their goals. In other words, if, for example, a country wants to industrialize, that's an objective, to achieve its vision of being maybe a middle-income or high-income country. The question then is, does it have the critical skills necessary to industrialize? Second thing is, does it have the key institutions and the key organizations that are necessary? Does it have a private sector that is capable of driving this agenda? Does it have the ability to design and actually implement industrial strategies and policies for it to transform itself? And if we do a capacity needs assessment, which is unique to ACBF, we will realize whether the country has the ability to do it or not. And that's how we begin to intervene to develop capacity development strategies and then implement those to address the skills, the human capacity angle, the institutional capacity angle, and far more importantly, what we call the soft capacity angle, which is about leadership, which is about mindset, which is about values, and which is about really having the self-confidence and self-belief.
Critics will hold that you have virtually done nothing since 1991, because if I take the human capacity aspect in particular, Africa has the highest number of expatriates working on the continent, which means that these are not Africans being used, and that billions and billions of dollars are wasted paying foreigners because we have not developed our own human resources in key areas. One study was done that in a country like Nigeria alone, at least $250 million for 12 families in a year is lost to foreign expatriates payment. What do you respond to such statistics?
Well, I would say that the person does not, if anybody makes such an allegation, I would just simply say that they should get their facts right. Number one, since ACBF has been created, we have invested more than $700 billion across the continent in 48 African countries. Number two is that in the process of this investment, we have created over 40 think tanks in the continent, and these are essential for the sort of good policies you see today in terms of evidence-based policy making and uptake of knowledge and capacity building. Number three, we have really developed the skills of thousands and thousands of middle-level, high-level economic management professionals across the continent. If you go, I was in Ghana, in Accra the other day, and I was told that over 30 staff members in the Ministry of Finance alone were all beneficiaries of ACBF's capacity development program. And you go everywhere, you see that. We have programs here in Cameroon, you know, that is dealing with economic policy management, that is also promoting research and policy analysis, supporting government policies, and helping to really build capacity of young men and women to be able to contribute to the economy. You
do a lot of research, yes, for policy consumption by your clients, yeah, or customers, which are African countries, institutions, both public and private. What do you get from your policy analysis as the main blocks or challenges or walls that impede or prevent or retard or stagnate the development process on the continent?
There are three important things I would mention. Number one is that our higher education institutions, unfortunately, many of them, unfortunately, are not educating Africa's young people to address Africa's problems. So this is the reason why you have a high number of graduates, but they are not necessarily either employable or self-employable. They are not really there's the mismatch between what is happening in the ivory tower and what is happening in the real economy. So we must address that.
Not skills oriented.
Exactly, that is mismatch, number one. Yes, exactly, so that we understand that knowledge and skills are not the same thing. That we have to have universities that are paying attention to the needs of the society and educating people so that they can be employable or self-employable to address the significant problem of youth unemployment. Number two is that we have not paid attention to our institutions and strengthening them so that they can play their effective roles. You know, because things like the parliament or even governmental economic institutions and social institutions, as well as some of the think tanks and organizations that are necessary to promote good policies and help implementation.
In yes. other words, we still have weak institutions, strong people.
Well, no, you see, you have people who are educated, but mostly do not have the skills.
At the level of institutional level, we
yes.
have so many powerful people with weak institutions who do not allow the institutions to function normally.
Well, I would say that we need to pay
I'm just paraphrasing Barack Obama in Ghana a few years ago.
Well, you see, we need to really have institutions that are very functional and high performing, that are strong enough to really make sure that policies are implemented and we have results on the ground. The third dimension is to ensure an area where we haven't paid attention. We haven't spent enough in capacity development. That is what our research is showing. As a matter of fact, the alarming fact at this point is if you look across the board, whether it is governments or it is the donors or it is other institutions, investment in capacity development is actually going down, and that is troubling.
What is the empirical evidence to that?
Our own research.
Yes. What is the level of the research analysis?
No, if you look at our report, our African capacity report that we publish every year, you can find that information there and see precisely who is, what is being spent, how much is being allocated by governments and by other, key investors in capacity development, how much they're putting in there. And for us, this is extremely important, that there must be an intensification of this investment. And we're in a position to really determine the best area to make sure that you have efficient investment. In other words, you invest in areas where the returns are going to be higher or highest. We have done an analysis, for example, of the capacity required to implement Agenda 2063 and SDGs in Africa. And we have found some very interesting and very important things. Of course, the most alarming being that the critical skills that are needed are quite lacking on the continent.
Let's take a workout question. What will be the role of the African Capacity Building Foundation in ensuring a maximum realization of Africa's 2063 agenda, which of course will be 100 years or the centenary of most African countries gaining independence from their colonial masters, which is a kind of vision by the African Union today?
As you know, ACBF helps to build capacity in a number of ways. First is that we try to mobilize resources, because capacity building is, requires resources. We mobilize resources internally and externally. The second thing is that we invest in capacity building, either through institutions, like universities or centers of excellence, or think tanks, or setting up policy analysis units, or other individuals who are involved in this, through grants and through direct investments and partnerships. Number three is that we also generate knowledge, as you rightly pointed out, and best practices, and share this knowledge with everybody, so that this will help in really having a better understanding and implementing capacity building programs. Number four is we also provide capacity development advisory services for a fee. If a country says, I want to know how I can establish a university, or how I can do this, or how do I address the issue of regional integration, we can help in that, or help even organizations such as the African Development Bank to ensure that the utilization of their resources is maximized on the ground and that results are achieved. Lastly, but not the least, is to promote innovation in capacity development and learning, so that in this day and age, innovation is very important. So ACBF is at the forefront of really coming out with innovative approaches that are there. So our contribution to achieving Agenda 2063 going forward is going to be even far more significant than before. After all, our vision is an Africa capable of achieving its own development. Well,
the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation, Professor Emmanuel Nnadozie. Thank you very much indeed for being guest on GlobeWatch.
Thank you very much. Thanks to your audience as well.
Okay.